It's a real privilege to be here this afternoon, and I'm really glad to see that there are so many young people in the audience, or at least younger than I, which I guess isn't that hard to do anymore. I'm going to follow up what Alan started by trying to speak about what we can think about as solutions to state repression. And that's a really challenging task, and I didn't realize how challenging in some respects until I began to organize some thoughts to this afternoon. And I'll get to that, to why it's so challenging in a minute. It is really hard to envision a different way of doing justice, a world without prisons, if you will. In order to even begin to make headway in that process, I think we have to understand that when we think about criminal justice, that's not enough. When we think about justice, it goes far beyond criminal justice, and it has to start and end with social and economic justice. The fundamental solutions to state repression, the ultimate manifestation of which is prisons, in fact lie outside of the criminal justice system itself. So I had to start by saying that because it helps me think about why it's so hard, the more that I do this work, to really think about alternatives to the way we do criminal justice in this country. But because I've been asked to speak more specifically about criminal justice, I'm going to try to stick to that topic. And so I think that the solutions, how we deal with the solutions, or the strategies to deal with the solutions, fall into the realm of community education, community organizing, and fundamental changes to how we define and operate criminal justice systems themselves. So the first part of the solution is to develop a savvy and informed community. We really have to ensure that people directly affected by the criminal justice system understand, and that's, as Alan just alluded to, that's really the majority of us, and particularly in poor communities and communities of color. We have to understand how the criminal justice system works and what it really does. This involves revealing the kind of information that Alan just alluded to. Who is in prison, for what, and how long. So an essential piece of a community education campaign will inform us that most people in prison are Black and Latino. They're in for drug crimes and nonviolent crimes. And that, as Alan just said, we impose prisons more often than any other country in the world. And also, we impose longer sentences. We lock people up not only more frequently, but for longer periods of time than anywhere else in the world. My guess is that you in this audience know that, but I have come to be unpleasantly surprised how many people don't know that. And in the work that we do, we see it every day in big and small examples. Last year, for example, in Syracuse, a number of young people were prosecuted under the federal RICO statute, the statute that usually is reserved for organized crime. These young people were mostly people in their late teens and early 20s, accused and convicted of gang-related activity. And the community initially was enthusiastic about the use of RICO. What they wanted was the youth gun violence to stop, and they wanted to feel safe. They wanted to be able to go out in their own communities without fear of harm, and they didn't want any more of their children killed. And so in desperation, they turned to law enforcement to stop the violence. but actually they were unfamiliar with what RICO really means. And they didn't know the length of the sentence that would be imposed on these 20-year-old young men that would make sure they would be old men before they saw the light of day. And they didn't know that when these young men would be incarcerated in the federal system, they wouldn't even be in the remote parts of New York State that are very difficult to get to. But they could well be in Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, that would make contact with their families virtually impossible. We see this in other ways. Folks desperate to get some help for their kids bring them into family court without knowing that they're starting down the slippery slope of the intrusion of the state into their lives. And an end result could be having their own children removed from their care and starting on a journey that begins to bring them deeper and deeper into the bowels of repressive state institutions. Folks don't know the difference, they don't know the process, they don't know the connections between arrest, pretrial detention, conviction, and incarceration. And so that is why education is really a critical part of the system. We have to expose the horrors of imprisonment. These are the institutions that we keep secret, and people don't know what's going on behind the walls. People don't know the inhumane, dehumanizing conditions that people live in. They can't fully appreciate what it means to be cut off from the outside world. We have to disabuse people of the notion that most prisons are club feds and that prisoners have it easy and get privileges. We have to expose facts like the so-called ringleader at Abu Ghraib, Charles Grainer, was formerly a prison guard in Pennsylvania, and that the conditions in most prisons in the United States are in fact quite similar to what we are horrified about in Iraq. We have to counter the notion that prisons are therapeutic environments. And just yesterday I was speaking with a young woman whose father was incarcerated, and I asked her how she experienced that. And she said that it brought some peace to her life because he was really out of control with respect to his drug addiction. And she thought prison was the place where he was going to get help. Needless to say, this young woman was African American and poor. In contrast, when the more privileged and whiter among us think about a therapeutic intervention for one of our family members, prisons would not come to mind. So a part of the education process is beginning to help people envision that there are other solutions to individual and social problems. This brings me into the second part of the solution, and that is community organizing and mobilizing that helps people demand reinvestment in health, schools, social welfare programs, jobs, employment. Those, in fact, are the real ways to prevent crime and the better, healthier ways to respond to problems that lead to crime. We have to expose the cost of prisons and demand a redirection of the obscene amounts of money that we spend on prisons into community development activities. In Onondaga County, we spend more than $35,000 a year per inmate to lock someone up in the local county facility. That would buy a college education even at an expensive institution like SU. It would pay for 2 young people to go to state college. It would pay for 4 young people to go to community college. $35,000 is 4 times what we spend on the average public school student in the city of Syracuse. There are growing examples around the country of organizing efforts to stop the prison industrial complex. Books Not Bars focuses on education rather than incarceration. There's an effort in New York City called Unlock the Block that organizes people to demand voting rights because felons are disenfranchised, that in turn dilutes the voting power of communities of color. We have to find ways of building alliances with poor white communities so that they have other means of economic